All right. Uh, Let me just turn off the. Excellent. So we have quite a few participants already, so I think it's good time to start the session now. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the third episode of fourth season of ITC's Women's Power Lunch. We have a very special guest with us today, Crystal Pratt. I'm going to give you a brief introduction of Crystal before we start asking her our questions, getting to know her better. But before that, I would like to say a big thank you to our working group. Uh, Adriana, Anya, Cynthia, Joni, Lida, Michelle, Roberta, Valentina, and Vadira, and also our male champions, Joe Rafael and Raymond, for a lot of work that goes in the back end. So, thank you for all the support. And with that, we will start the session today. So, really, it's a pleasure to have you with us today, Crystal. Just a brief introduction of her. So, Crystal Pratt has 30 years of policy and practice experience at national, regional, and international levels, and she has dedicated her public services to supporting a plethora of development issues, including climate change and disaster risk resilience and ocean governance. She is currently the Assistant Secretary General for Environment and Climate Actions at the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States. Prior to that, she was the Pacific Islands Forum's Deputy Secretary General and was the CEO of Pacific Islands Applied Geoscience Commissions from 2004 to 2010, which is now a division of Pacific Community. Christelle has consulted on climate change, risk resilience, and ocean governance for various international organizations, and has also worked in the private sector in enterprise risk management and business continuity. So, we are very pleased to have her with us today to speak about her career journey and some of the lessons she's learned along the way. So, today's session will be focused on gender balanced leadership that she's quite passionate about. And we will soon also open the floor to our participants to ask her pertinent questions. Before we dig into the session, I would also like to congratulate Crystal on behalf of ITC on being honored with the European Women's International Leadership Award of 2024. So big congratulations to you. And just reading your introduction, Crystal. I mean, it's amazing how you've achieved so many things. Um, I would request everyone to to mute themselves. I hear some echo. Uh, after this introduction, Christelle, beyond your official biography, we would really like to get to know you. So, could you share with us a brief a journey, a brief about your professional journey on what it has been like to move from Fiji to Australia to study geology and then working in international diplomacy and working with OACPS? Could you please share more?
Well, thank you very much, Akshata, and thank you to your colleagues in the working group, as well as to all of those ITC women and ITC colleagues that are joining us for this hour, and for me to have this exchange and a conversation with you all. And thanks for the question, but maybe I'd like to back up a little bit before actually winging my way to Australia, so to speak, to start university. I was born almost 6 decades ago, which is a rather scary thought, but nevertheless, on a small island on the Blue Pacific continent, and I'll come back to the Blue Pacific continent in a little while. And you know, my life started out with my family around me. But unfortunately, when I was just 2 years old, we lost my biological father to the ocean. He went fishing and he never came back. And yet that didn't deter me from my love of the ocean. And you know, fortunately, my mother and my 2 sisters were joined by our adopted father, who really took care of me. And I think in many respects, I have my parents to thank for who I am today. Um, as as I was growing up, as I mentioned, I mean, the ocean was very central to me because on small islands, the ocean is not so far away, and it brings great joy, but it also can bring wrath, as we see, with the various hurricanes and cyclones that are increasing in frequency because of climate change, and also, storm surges, sea level rise, and, various other things. So there's two sides to the oceans, um, and I, in many respects, I guess, unconsciously or subconsciously committed myself and my life to the ocean from a very young age. As growing up as well, I mean, I actually was quite sporty, not so much anymore, but I represented Fiji as a swimmer in what was then called the South Pacific Games when I was about 12 or something. And that too really shaped me, to realise how you can, in terms of servitude and representation, or what hard work really means, having to get up very, very early in the morning, swimming up and down in a swimming pool, doesn't sound like a whole lot of fun, but, eventually when you do represent your country, it is really such an honour. But I went through school and really was very attracted to numbers and the sciences. So again, I really support those that choose science, technology, engineering, and maths. And I'm a real advocate for women pursuing careers in STEM and studying and reading STEM disciplines. And I think that we need to have more women in science and technology. So that was really my basic training. And then came the next stage. What do I do next? And of course, the natural thing for me was to try to get a scholarship to go to university. My family couldn't really afford that, and I had to compete. And at the time in Fiji, we there were minority groups, and I am not Indigenous Fijian, I'm not Ikake. And so I had to compete for a very small number of scholarships to study. And so these are when we start making choices, so I think that many of my family members thought I would go on to study law or become a doctor or, an accountant and the general sort of traditional fields of study. But I wanted to actually be a mining engineer. And possibly just because it was different and because I felt that it was bucking the sort of traditional norms. But unfortunately, I was not allowed to study mining engineering. Women were not allowed to go underground those years ago, more than, whatever it is, 4 decades ago. And so I had to settle for geoscience or earth system science. And it perhaps is one of the last male bastions. So my time at university was very interesting. Very few women in our classes. But what it did teach me was, actually we're people after all. I mean, yes, of course, there are men and women, girls and boys that make up the world. But at the end of it, you're a human being and you do your utmost and your level best to succeed. And so I studied geology as a basic degree and then did some postgraduate work as, again, back to the ocean, marine geoscience. And so I became a marine geologist and had a fantastic experience at university as a research assistant to an eminent professor. And then I went back to Fiji and joined the Fiji government and worked in their marine geoscience division. Then eventually took over the geoscience division. But that opportunity gave me it was incredible. I was involved in international marine scientific research cruises. And I was engaging, notwithstanding I was quite young, I was engaging in various multilateral meetings about the ocean and about natural resources. Um, and, so that early part in the Fiji government really did start to shape me and to get me to start to think about, whether I really wanted to specialise or really what I wanted to do at all. And so I went to Canada to, in fact, study marine law and policy because I felt that it would be useful to have scientists being involved in some of these multilateral negotiations, whether it be on implementation of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. And as we see now, there are other new agreements attached to that, like, biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction, the plastics pollution, the plastics treaty, those sorts of things, which are all related to the ocean. And realizing that science and scientists were important in how we frame policy so that it actually delivers, appropriate, tangible results. But I did leave the Fiji government for personal reasons a few years later after coming back from Canada and moved into the private sector in Auckland. And you've already touched on that. Really starting to think about other opportunities and options. And so it goes back to, these sort of, if you like, linear professional pathways. Nothing needs to be linear. And I think that what you study at university, you may still, of course, continue in that profession. But what I've found is that I did practice as a geoscientist for a number of years, but I quickly moved away from that and became a scientific administrator after my private sector experience, in risk governance, and returned to the Pacific to set up an ocean program at the Pacific Islands Applied Geoscience Commission. And so apart from actually setting up the program, I did support the management team at the time in their change process. And eventually, as part of that, when the opportunity to become the Director General came up, about 4 years after I joined the agency, I was encouraged to apply to become the first female Director General in the Pacific, but also of a very male-dominated agency for science and technology. And I applied, and I was so pleased that the members had huge confidence and faith that they wanted somebody like me, to head the agency. I was in my late 30s then, and so there were quite a number of decisions that were made by the region that I thought was really significant at the time. To choose a young professional to lead an important organisation. It was an organisation that served 23 member states, and to head an organisation that was, if you like, traditionally male, both in terms of its staff complement as well as, the usual heads of the agency. And so when I took that organisation over, all I was thinking was I wanted to make sure that it just stayed on an even keel, that it didn't reduce itself in terms of its budget. It maintained services and so on. And I served 2 3-year contracts. And I was pleasantly surprised, I guess, when I came to the end of the 6 years and found that we had quadrupled our budget and more than doubled our staff, and that we had, as well as that, become an organisation that was even more respected and recognised by the members, but also by partners. And so I guess what that taught me was, with certain intentions and being really respectful, I think that was something that I have always maintained, and respectful of whoever was in the organisation, everybody in an organisation is important. Um, you know, uh, but I think as well as that, making sure that leading in a collegiate way was extremely important. I had excellent colleagues in the management team, and by the time I finished, we did have, quite a number of women in the organisation, but they were recruited based on the fact that they deserved to be in the organisation, that they merited being in the organisation. And in fact, today, now that organisation is part of the Pacific community, it is being headed by somebody that was in one of my teams some years ago now. But nevertheless, she's risen up through the ranks from being a junior professional in my when I was there to becoming the director, of this division of the SPC, and it's an even larger division than when I was in charge. But then I took about 4 years off when I finished at SOPAC, as it was called, to really connect with my son. I had him when in the first year of being Chief Executive Officer of SOPAC, and so I felt that he deserved a little bit of my time. So I took some time off, but in fact, it was probably the busiest time of my life, in that I did consulting for the World Bank and the Australian government, some UN agencies, some Pacific regional agencies, and so on. And so it was perhaps one of the busiest times, but it forced me to be very, very focused. And I was able to work with the region to develop two regional policies during that time. One on the oceans, the Pacific, a framework for the Pacific Oceanscape, which endures today, and we see some really concrete actions being achieved because of this framework, and I'm quite proud of being involved in that. And then also a framework for resilient development in the Pacific, and so that was quite forward-leaning, and that it really was making the case, about more than 10 years ago now, that climate change and disaster risk really needed to be integrated, that climate change and disaster risk or risk needed to be an underpinning imperative of development. So those two policies, while I was playing with my son, and then I became the Deputy Secretary General of the Pacific Islands Forum, and really supported Secretary General Dame Meg Taylor through 6 years of reforms. And we came into an organisation that wasn't particularly healthy financially, and it didn't really have members' ownership and commitment. And by that, the metrics really were a very low level of representation at leaders' meetings, at ministerial meetings, at officials' meetings. And in 6 years, Dame Meg and I worked really hard to turn the organisation around, give it a new narrative, build confidence in the membership, so the levels of representation were increased. We rarely had special envoys to our leaders' meetings. We generally always had ministers at the table for our ministerials. And at senior level, the secretaries for the ministries in charge, so our secretaries for foreign affairs, generally would come to the meeting. So that for me was an interesting experience in terms of moving. So I've moved from being a small island girl to geologist because I just wanted really to be different. But that gave me such a wonderful opportunity to realise that you can pretty much do anything you want. Becoming a science administrator, and then actually moving from science administration into working for the political agency in the Pacific. And so my career has really shifted quite a lot. And then, of course, after the Pacific Islands Forum, this opportunity of becoming an Assistant Secretary General at the Organisation of African, Caribbean, Pacific States was presented. And I thought, how terribly exciting to work for 79 countries from the global south, and to expand, if you like, my public service from the Pacific, into the African, Caribbean, and Pacific regions. So shall I leave it there? But really perhaps just to say that some of my choices, because you did ask about that, like, I mean, how deliberate was I? In some ways, I would like to say that, I had mapped it out, but um, I didn't. These opportunities presented themselves, and I put my hand up for them. And in these cases, those organisations must have seen something in me to say, "We'd like you to serve." Thanks, Sasha.
Thank you so much, Christelle. I mean, first of all, thanks for being so open about your professional as well as personal journey that has led you to being the Assistant Secretary General at OACPS. I hear a lot about from what you've just said that even though the choices that you made were not linear or you took the opportunities that you saw potential in, I'm sure it came a lot also with taking risks. And it's really inspiring to see how you've navigated through these various opportunities that you've got along the way to steer your career from one to the other direction. I would like to spend some time now to get to learn from you that you've mentioned that you are quite passionate about gender balanced leadership, and that's a topic that we would like to learn from you. So, as stepping into the shoes of leadership, how did you achieve that? Were there challenges on the way? And would you have some advice for us, women here who are eager to learn about it from you?
Oh, yes. I mean, I think I touched on it a little bit, when I gave you a wee bit of a glimpse into my appointment as SOPAC's, Chief Executive Officer or Director General. And at the time, there were as many that were supportive as were concerned whether a woman could head or the science and technology agency for the Pacific region. And when I did assume the position, the management team were all men, and at that stage, I mean, it was a natural setting. But the way in which I engaged was as I always have engaged. So I've always really wanted to be as inclusive and as meaningfully inclusive as possible, and attentive and listening. So whether that be, in a management meeting or in meetings with others, meetings with staff and so on, I've always really tried to embrace those principles, and really working as collegiately as possible. And so we all bring different perspectives to the table. And so, in my first months, as much of my involvement was really including and listening to those that were in the management team. And I'd just like to share that, in fact, one member of the management was my superior in the organisation, and had he had also thrown in his hat, so to speak, for the position, for the job. And so, of course, he was extremely disappointed. He had a much more extensive experience rating than I had, and perhaps couldn't understand why the decisions by the member states was to appoint me. And so I worked really hard on that relationship because I realised that he had still a lot to give to the organisation, and I had a lot to learn from him. And I must say that while it was perhaps a few difficult first weeks and months for him, the way in which I managed the organisation or led the organisation made him feel valued and included. And so I think that, that's something that's really important. And it's something that really is one of my, it's a major guide for me. And I have done that in all of the work that I do, because I think everybody has something to offer, and everybody is different, and that's what makes things so interesting. And so you do need to allow people to ventilate their perspectives, provide contributions, and if you listen and you're inclusive, you come out with some of the, you come out with better outcomes, in the long run and in the end. As I said, I mean, that management team was mainly men, and I was a bit of an aberration for them, perhaps. But as we recruited and as we turned over the staff, I was fortunate to be able to, and the organisation was fortunate to be able to attract other women who joined the management team. And so they, I think in terms of gender balanced teams, I think you need a balance of both male as well as female perspectives. And so we were able to build an organisation, and I think that was one of the secrets to our success of building the organisation in terms of size as well as in terms of confidence, because with a quadrupling of budget in 6 years, I think that really is a sign of confidence by partners, as well as by the membership. And so I was able to bring a gender balance into that team. Now I'd like to just sort of maybe share another example. At the Pacific Islands Forum, when I joined as a Deputy Secretary General, we had an executive structure where there was one Secretary General and two Deputy Secretary Generals. And that executive team was all women. So it was seen as historic, which it was. But I must say that, and people, were extremely impressed by that. But to be honest with you all, what I found was that having come from an executive management team that was balanced and represented, I did find it really difficult that we didn't have that diversity of perspective, and that sometimes, and this might come as a bit of a shock to some of you, but I'm just trying to be as honest and as open as possible in this conversation, is that there are times when women are not the best champions of women and for women. And I say that, I do say that with both respect and humility, because of course we're all different, we're all human beings. But there are times when I do feel that women in senior roles and in leadership roles do not necessarily make special, I want to use the word dispensation, that's not quite the right word, but we don't always consider this treatment of and being a role model and bringing other women at lower levels up through the ranks, and in some instances being there as a sounding board, being there to if you like hold hands on things, and to provide that respectful relationship, and sharing the space, for want of a better word. I mean, some of us, it's quite competitive, and perhaps sometimes we don't always err on the side of bringing other women through. I know I've spoken in double, sort of between the lines. I'm sure that you'll be able to read into what I've just shared, but it is an observation, and this is why I think balanced teams bring some of the best results. because of those different perspectives of being a man or being a woman.
Well, thank you, Chriselle, for sharing that experience and being so honest with us. And I'm sure there's a lot to learn, but also there are probably some follow-up questions that the participants on call may have. So I'm going to open the floor for anybody to raise their hand. But before we do that, I just have one final question for you before we go into the Q&A section. Is something that you touched upon earlier was the importance of people in STEM working in policy, and how that really shapes a policy when it comes to maybe environment or climate action, and which is key. But could you touch upon a little bit about the important or the key role that women play in climate action, or women in STEM even play in climate action?
Well, I think that I could probably answer that question at a whole range of levels. Um, but of course, I think that um, women at the front line, um, our communities at the front line, I mean, without women being involved um, in adapting, um, mitigating, reducing risk, to climate change and other external forces, means that we're just missing out on um, a huge capacity to be able to respond positively to these global as well as local crises that we're facing as a result of these major shocks and external shocks. Um, and we have to include, and so for them to be involved, they need to be included um, in all aspects of decision making. And so, right from the grassroots up to, um, the negotiations that we become involved in at the multilateral level, and all of the levels in between. Um, and so, I'm always really impressed with the fact that there are women now in the negotiation rooms. There are women who are leading or are lead negotiators for their countries. Um, that there are women now heading science organisations. We have women as vice chancellors, um, and so on. And so I think that it really is important, because if we don't, then we're really leaving out more than half of the population of the blue planet. Um, I think that having women involved in climate action, emphasis on action, um, at both policy and practice levels is important, because it goes back to what I was saying. We just have a different lived experience, and we bring different perspectives. Um, and so if we leave women out of those conversations, out of decision making processes, um, then we're really not going to be able to address the problems that we have with appropriate solutions. Um, it, it will not happen. Um, I, I would also offer that women bring a certain creativity to problem solving, because we're constantly managing things, whether it be at work or whether it be at home. And we know that, for the large part, there are women that are, and many of you online, have your professional lives, but you also have your personal lives, which are as involved and really quite consuming. And I do sometimes think about that. I mean, um, if we were not as organised as we are, I think we would be in even more considerable disarray than we find ourselves in, whether that be at the personal level or at the professional level.
No,
So
that's
women matter. a lot.
Absolutely. That's very well put, and completely echo your opinion on participation of women at all levels is key for any action relating to climate or other fields even. Perfect. So thank you so much. I would now like to invite our colleagues online to please raise your hand so you can pose the question directly to Christelle. I'm going to stop recording at this point, so it will give you a few seconds. So please use the raise hand feature so that we can identify who would like to ask the question. And